Hello, so good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening again, depending on what time you're listening to this recording. So, welcome to part two of the equilibrium module, and where we'll be talking about shifts and equilibrium. So, what happens when the demand curve or the supply curve or both shift? What happens to the equilibrium price, and what happens to the equilibrium quantity? So, we'll be talking about that today using several examples. We'll be using five for today, just to make it a bit quicker than normal. And the background today is Newcastle upon Tyne. So this is where I did my undergraduate degree, and it's a city that's very close to my heart. And until recently, I was just there. So again, it's a wonderful city. If you've ever got a chance to visit, please do. These are the bridges. Newcastle's quite well known for its amazing bridges. Anyways, and Newcastle is also well known for having a lot of coal mines back in the day. So Newcastle used to be one of the biggest sources of coal in the world until they've shut it down. They've shut it down a couple of decades ago. And there is a phrase which we call "bring coal to Newcastle." It's not too common nowadays, but it used to be an idiom. Basically, when you say it's like bringing coals to Newcastle, that means it's a futile task. Okay, and the main reason for that, as we shall see, it's because Newcastle has such a huge supply of coal that if we bring additional coal in, the price is so low that you'll be making a loss. So that's the reason why we say it's like bringing coal to Newcastle. It's a futile task because Newcastle has so much coal in it. Why would you sell coal there? Okay, so most of the slides today will be talking about how we could do what happens when the supply and demand curve shift, and we'll be dealing with that today. Okay. So, just a recap on equilibrium. So again, we've got our supply curve and our demand curve. And again, the x-axis is the quantity of the good, and the y-axis is the price of the good. And we recall that the supply curve is upward sloping and the demand curve is downward sloping, right? So that's the supply curve and that's the demand curve. Remember, law of supply, as we increase the price, more people would want to sell that good, therefore we got an upward sloping curve. And the demand curve, the law of demand, the more expensive the price is, less people would want to buy the good. So therefore we got a downward sloping curve. And again, the intersection point between these two, as we've already discussed, is what we call the equilibrium point. And the price at the equilibrium point is what we call the equilibrium price, and the quantity at the equilibrium point is what we call the equilibrium quantity. Okay. So we've got these definitions before. The equilibrium price, again, is the price at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. And again, at the equilibrium price, we neither have a shortage nor a surplus. Okay, so the price that produces neither a shortage nor surplus. And again, the golden rule when it comes to free markets is if the market is free, the price will tend to go towards the equilibrium price. And of course, the equilibrium quantity is just the quantity at the equilibrium price. So, supply and demand curves, however, do not always remain the same. We've seen this in the supply modules, we've seen this in the demand modules. We can have shifts in supply and we can have shifts in demand, right? So, remember that? Let's see. So, if we got a supply curve here, remember that it could shift to the right. And for demand curves as well, it could also shift to the right. Okay, again, we've got various factors that shift the demand and the supply curve. Please refer to your notes from the supply and demand module because, again, we'll not be discussing how these things shift. It's just that we'll be applying these shifts, okay? So, the question is, what happens now to the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity when shifts occur? Okay, so this is a very important question in economics because, again, in economics, we usually start from a market that already has an equilibrium price, has an equilibrium quantity, and then things start happening. And so now the question is, what happens to the price and the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity when things start to happen? Okay. So here are the steps that we can take the steps to follow in determining what happens when supply or demand or both shift. Okay, and again, here's just a beautiful background of Newcastle, just for picture's sake. All right, so here are the steps. So the first step, so we'll divide these steps. There's 5 steps in total, but we'll divide it into 2. So the first set of activities is what we call the identification stage. So this is where we identify, given a scenario, okay, let's say there was a war, something like that, or there was an increase in the price of inputs. We first identify the curve to shift. So is it the supply curve that shifts? Is it the demand curve that shifts? Is it both, or is it neither, right? So whenever we're given, remember in economics, we don't just talk about, okay, the demand curve shifts, right? We're first given a scenario, a situation. Let's say the price of the inputs changes. So what curve does that belong to? Okay, so for that example, the supply curve will shift, but for demand, that's not going to affect the demand of consumers, right? Because the price of inputs does not affect demand, right? And so we first need to identify, is it the supply curve or is it the demand curve, or is it both that we're trying to that's going to shift because of events? Secondly, we identify the direction of the shift. Is it left or is it right? And again, if the shift is to the left, that means it's either supply or demand decreases. Even if the shift is to the right, that means demand or supply increases. And then after that, we apply the shift. The second group of activities that we do is called the analysis. Okay, so what are the effects now that we've shifted the demand or supply curve, or both? Okay, so step number 4, we check for the new equilibrium price and quantity. So what happens to equilibrium price and what happens to quantity? Does the equilibrium price increase or does it decrease? And does the equilibrium quantity increase or decrease? And we also do a reality check. How realistic is this? Remember, economics only seeks to describe sometimes how the world works, or prescribe how it should work. So we need to do a reality check. Is this consistent with what we see in real life? Now, there is an additional step, which is as a check. If both the supply and demand curves shift, we need to check what happens if the sizes of the shifts change. Because sometimes if the shift in demand is bigger than the shift in supply, something might happen. But if the other way around happens, then another completely different thing happens. So we need to check small shifts and big shifts if both supply and demand shift. Okay, so I think the best thing to do is to illustrate these with examples. So we'll be doing 5 examples for this lecture, and hopefully you could follow along. Okay, I don't know, depending on the time, given that it's quite late right now when I'm recording this, I don't know if I'll be able to give you additional examples at the end of the lecture series, but in case I don't, let these examples serve as a general principle to help you with supply and demand curve analysis. And by the way, this is a very famous thing to do in economics. Identify what happens when the curves shift. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, let's start first with an easy example. Okay, so let's start with rice and drought. Consider this scenario. What happens to the equilibrium price and quantity of rice when a drought occurs? Okay, so we talked about droughts before in some of the modules that we did. So what happens to price and quantity if the drought occurs? So the first thing we need to do is we first need to identify which curves are we going to shift. Okay, is it the demand curve or is it the supply curve? So does drought affect the demand for rice? I can't see how drought will affect people's demand for rice. I mean, maybe water, but not rice, right? So we can say that demand is not affected by drought. So we can say that the demand curve doesn't shift, right? How about supply? Does drought affect supply for rice? Well, if you remember our lectures from before, from the supply module, drought is one of those natural and social factors, right? And drought is actually one of the biggest ones when it comes to agricultural produce. So does drought affect supply for rice? Yes, it does. And so now the next question that we ask ourselves is, how does it affect the supply for rice? What's the direction of the shift? So the main question is, will there be more rice or will there be less rice when we get a drought? If there's more, then we will shift the supply curve to the right. If there is less, then we need to shift the supply curve to the left. So have a think. If there is a drought, do we expect rice production to increase or do we expect it to decrease? of course, we expect it to decrease, which means there will be a shift to the left. Okay? The next step is to apply the shift. So before we can apply the shift, we probably need the curves first to shift, right? So let's draw in our price versus quantity curve, and there's a supply curve and there's a demand curve, right? And again, so we take, and of course we have the equilibrium, the original equilibrium, which is in purple, okay? And now what happens? What happens when there's a drought? We said that the supply curve shifts to the left. So let's do that. So there's a supply curve there, and we shift it to the left. And we identify the new equilibrium point, which is, again, the intersection between the supply curve and the demand curve. This is our new supply curve. The demand curve doesn't shift, right? And so now the intersection of that is our new equilibrium point. So let's have a look. Let's check the new equilibrium price and quantity. So let's have a look at the equilibrium price. So let's compare. So our old point, again, it's the purple one. So we draw a line there at the price. So that's the original equilibrium price. And the new equilibrium price, that's the point in purple, in gray, I'm sorry. Let's draw a line there. And that's the new equilibrium price. So what happens here, right? So this is the original equilibrium price, and it's the new equilibrium price. Remember, the y-axis, as we go up, it increases. So what happens to equilibrium price here? From here to here, that is going up. So equilibrium price increases, right? And what happens to equilibrium quantity? What happens to the amount of rice produced? Well, first of all, we draw a line there again, this time a vertical line, because we're looking at quantity, and that's the original equilibrium quantity. And let's look at the new equilibrium quantity, which again, the gray one there, that's a new equilibrium quantity. And again, for graphs, from left to right, we are increasing quantity. However, for this one, notice the original equilibrium quantity is more than the new equilibrium quantity. So there's a decrease in the equilibrium quantity, right? So that's what happens. And so now let's do a reality check. Is this real? In real life, does this actually happen? Well, yes, right? If there is a drought, first of all, we know there will be less rice produced. Okay, so the quality just does go down. At the same time, we know that the equilibrium price also increases, right? We know that price increases because, there's less rice to go around. It's harder to produce rice. Okay, so this is something that we do see in real life. And so that's just a quick reality check. Okay, I hope this first example is clear. The rest of the examples will be very similar to what we've done here. So I hope you could follow along. If not, if you didn't understand this, then hopefully the next few examples will solidify how we do shifts in equilibrium. Okay, so let's go on. Let's move on to example 2. So let's talk about the airline industry in the wake of COVID-19. So this is when COVID-19 just hit. So many new travel restrictions come in. This is before airlines decide to cut down on flights. So here's a picture of London Heathrow. This before COVID-19, because I can tell you right now, Heathrow does not look like this now. There's a lot of empty seats because people are not allowed to sit next to each other. Okay, so let's have a look. Let's consider this second example. What did the advent of COVID-19 initially do to flights? So we're going to talk about initial. Okay, what happened immediately when COVID-19 became a worldwide pandemic? Before companies had a chance to change how the flights work. So first of all, we identify the shift. Is it the demand curve? Is it the supply curve? Let's look at it one by one. First, did COVID-19 affect the demand for flights? Well, of course it did, right? Travel bans. People didn't want to catch COVID-19 from, say, the first places affected, right? Which is like China, Italy, and all of these places. So yes, COVID-19 did affect the demand for flights, okay? But how about the supply? Did COVID-19 straightforwardly, did it affect the supply of flights that airlines could offer? Initially, no, right? You might have a few pilots who are sick or who are ill, but I like the pandemic, if it wasn't for the airlines actually artificially lowering the supply, at first it didn't, right? It did not affect the supply of flights. Okay, because what do you need in an airline? You need the pilot, you need the airplane. Does COVID-19 affect any of those except for some of the pilots? Not really, right? So again, it doesn't affect supply in the beginning at the advent. Okay. So now, next question is identify the direction of the shift. How does demand change due to COVID-19? So, will people want to fly more or will people want to fly less because of COVID-19? So, if they want to fly more, then that means demand increases, shift to the right. Demand, if they want to fly less, demand decreases, shift to the left. And we just mentioned that again, you'd probably be less willing to fly, especially for holiday, if there's a pandemic going around. So, the demand is less, so we shift to the left. Okay. Step 3. Let's apply the shift. So again, let's draw in our original curves. That's original supply curve, original demand curve, original equilibrium. Okay? Simple as that, hopefully. Now, we apply the shift. And again, we said the demand curve, which is the red one, shifts to the left. Right? So let's draw in the new demand curve. And now, that's our new demand curve. That's the supply curve didn't change, right? So our equilibrium point is the intersection of that, and that's our new equilibrium point. And again, we'll use color gray. So next, let's check the new equilibrium price and quantity. Let's check the effects of the shift on the equilibrium price and the quantity. So the equilibrium price, let's have a look, okay? So original price is in purple. We see that it's there. And the new price is in gray. That's there as well. So notice here, what happens to the price? The price goes down, right? So we expect the price goes down. How about the equilibrium quantity? So this time let's draw vertical lines that pass through the original equilibrium. And let's draw a vertical line that passes through the new equilibrium over there. So notice what happens here. Again, we move the purple's the original, the gray is the new one. Notice that there's a move towards the left. There's less flights, right? So we see equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity both decreased. Reality check. Did this really happen? Yes. Okay. Even now, right? There's just not that many flights available. There's just not that many people flying, right? And the reality is actually on the first 48 hours when COVID-19 became a big thing, prices just really dropped. Okay, before a ticket, let's say a ticket from the Philippines to Europe, let's say, it would set you back around. This is the currency I'm familiar with. It set you back £800 usually for a return trip. But when COVID-19 hit, really, especially these automated machines, you can get for like half the price, even less than that. However, what happened later on is that airlines started to close down, airports started to close down, and so what happened was supply shifted as well, which meant that the powers of the airlines became bigger, so the prices went up. Okay, but originally, before airlines figured out that there was this pandemic going on and that they need to artificially restrict supply, the quantity, the price actually went down. Okay, and until now, quantity is still down. Okay, you could sit in an airplane right now and you'd have the whole row to yourself, even in economy. Okay, because that's what I experienced. Okay, I hope that's clear. Let's move on to example 3. Books and the printing press. So remember from the supply module, we talk about what happens when the printing press arrived. What happened to the written word? And remember, we said that it became more widely available. Books became more widely available. And now the first university in the world to have its own printing press is the University of Cambridge. And this is a picture of St. John's College. It's genuinely one of the most beautiful colleges in Cambridge. If you ever got the time to visit, honestly, if you visit between the two universities, Oxford and Cambridge, please do visit Cambridge. It's much better, okay? And they've got they also got the older press, okay? Anyways, let's move on to the actual example. Example 3. What happens to books when a printing press opens up? So again, let's identify whether this is a demand shift or a supply shift. So, Does the printing press affect the demand for books? Sure, I mean it doesn't, right? It doesn't really affect. It doesn't matter how the consumers don't really care how the book gets to them as long as it does get to them, right? So no, it doesn't affect the demand. How about does the printing press affect the supply of books though? Yes, it does, right? Technology. Remember technology, right? It the more technology because now it's easier for us to create books. It takes less time. It takes yeah, but it affects the supply. Okay, getting ahead of myself. That's step two and how to when we identify the direction of the shift. So will there be more books or less books because of the printing press? And again, we've talked about this. This is technology. What happens when there's technology? Supply increases, right? So more books. Supply shifts to the right. Okay? And now let's move on. Let's apply the shift. Okay? So we got our original supply curve there and our original demand curve there. Demand curve doesn't move, so the red line stays. However, the supply curve does move, and by the way, that's a equilibrium. The supply curve does move to the right because we got more books now because of the printing press. And again, new intersection. The red line doesn't move, the blue line does move to become the dotted blue line. So that's our new equilibrium. So once again, we check the new equilibrium price and quantity. Let's check equilibrium price first. We always check price before quantity, but you could do it the other way around. Doesn't matter. So let's draw a line on the equilibrium price. Did you notice that's the purple one, and the new equilibrium price, that's the gray one. So what happens here? From the price originally here, it goes down, right? It goes down here. So equilibrium price goes down. Let's check equilibrium quantity. That's our original one there, and that's a new one there. Notice this goes from here to here, right? The equilibrium quantity goes from here to here. We increase. Now there's more books. Not only do we have more books, we have more books for less of a price. Reality check. What actually did happen when the printing press was introduced? Well, we know from the supply module, the quantity increased. It shot up by a lot, right? We have more books available to the public. And also, the price went down, right? It is not a coincidence that Protestantism, the Reformation, started just a few years after the printing press was made, right? Because for Protestants, the Bible is the most important book, and most of the basis of faith is on the Bible. And now you would not be able to have a sect of Christianity that would be so focused on the Bible if the Bible wasn't readily available for everyone, if it wasn't cheap enough for people to buy. Okay, back in the day, especially like even in the early 300s and all of that, it would be an absolutely only like kings could afford a full Bible. Most of the time, regular folk probably could only afford the Gospels. Okay, and that's actually quite a weird thing to think that the Bible, until the printing press was made, usually wasn't sold as a one book. Why? Because it was too expensive. So with the printing press, both the quantity goes up and the price goes down. Okay, so that's what happens, and it's a reality check. That is actually what happens. And again, we're just following a simple set of rules. These are stuff that you already know. And the amazing thing is, it actually predicts quite well what happened in reality. We're not bending reality to these models. We're just using these models, applying a few basic rules that we already know, and it just so happens that these models actually do predict what actually happened, right? So that's the magic of these kinds of analysis. Let's move on to example number 4. Example number 4, computers and Moore's law. So let's talk about computers now. Example 4. What happens when more of the population requires computers for their work? But at the same time, technology is also improving. Okay? So now we've got a dual effect. Let's identify it first. Is demand for computers affected? Well, yes. More people and supply. And yes, more people want to buy, more people require computers. That's going to affect demand. Is supply for computers affected? Yes. Technology, right? We just had that in the previous example, how technology causes shifts in supply. So, second question, let's identify the direction of the shift. Demand. How does an increase of the population that require computers affect the demand for computers? Recall from your demand module, right? More people want to buy, what happens? Demand increases. Demand shifts to the right. Supply. What happens to supply as technology improves? And again, we've seen this in example 3. We know supply increases, it shifts to the right. So let's move on to the actual shifting of the curve. Okay. So now the thing is, we've got two shifts happening. So that's our original supply curve, original demand curve. Both of them will shift. This is the important thing. We have two things shifting. So the first thing we need to do is we need to try what happens when we've got a small shift in one and a large shift in the other. So let's try first a small shift in supply and a large shift in demand. So blue is supply, let's shift that by a tiny bit over there. And demand, let's shift that a huge bit over there. Okay? So now we're going to find the intersection between the new supply curve and the new demand curve. So that's going to be over there, the gray one over there. Okay? So that's going to be our new equilibrium. And again, same. Let's check new equilibrium price and quantity. Let's check for price first. And again, purple, that's equilibrium price. Gray, that's the new equilibrium price. Notice again, it increases, right? It goes up. So it increases. Now, let's check for equilibrium quantity. And again, we draw vertical lines. First on the original one, which is the purple one. And the new one, which is the gray one. So again, it also increases. However, the story is not yet done because we got two. Let's try what happens if it's the other way around. What if we got large supply shift but small demand shift? We try another shift. This is step 5, right? So we draw it again. There's our original equilibrium. Let's try now a large shift in supply over there, but a very, very small shift in demand over there. And again, the intersection is the intersection between the new demand curve and the new supply curve, which is over here. Right? Now let's remove these arrows and let's have a look at what happens to equilibrium price now. So what happens to equilibrium price? There's the original equilibrium price, there's a new equilibrium price. This time it goes down. However, for equilibrium quantity, again, let's have a look. Vertical line on the purple line dot, horizontal vertical line on the gray line. It goes up. So what happens here, right? Let's summarize what we just saw between these two graphs. And again, same shift. We both shift supply and demand to the same direction, but in different magnitudes. There's a different odd amount of shifting. And we can see we have two different results. To summarize what happened. So if we got a small shift in supply first and a large shift in demand, so that's the first one, the equilibrium price goes up and the equilibrium quantity goes up as well. However, if the shift in supply is large compared to the shift in demand, the equilibrium price this time goes down and the equilibrium price goes up. So if both supply and demand shift to the right, we see that the equilibrium quantity goes up. Right? In both cases it goes up. But for the equilibrium price, it depends. It depends on how much the shift in supply changes in the shift in demand. So it depends. So, in reality, we know what actually happened. Usually, the answer would be, what happens to equilibrium price? I don't know, it depends. However, for this example, we know what actually happened, right? Moore's law happened. The number of transistors in an integrated circuit doubles every 2 years. i.e., technology gets more and more powerful every 2 years. And you can see what happened. The equilibrium price actually shot down. It goes way down. However, this is an example where we actually have data to know what actually happened. But if we were to ask to predict what would happen in the future, it depends. Is the shift in supply greater than the shift in demand, or is it the other way around? Okay, so the answer would be, I don't know, it depends. But I know quantity would definitely increase, but that's as far as I can get. Okay. All right, let's now move on to example number 5. Okay, so not a lot more to go. Okay, guys, almost done. orange juice. So this is a completely hypothetical scenario, okay? Which means we can't really check what's going to happen in real life. So due to worker strikes, the town's local orange juice factory had to shut down for several days. Sad, I know. But at the same time, there was a new magazine article that claims that orange juice has these amazing health benefits never reported before. So what happens to equilibrium price and quality for orange juice? Okay, let's have a look. Again, first one, identify the shift. Does demand shift? Does supply shift? Let's ask first, is demand for orange juice affected? Yes, right? Tastes and preferences, right? So demand for orange juice, yes. Because now there's a new health benefit. I'm sure some people will have read this magazine and would want to go buy orange juice. So demand's gonna go up. Is supply for oranges affected? Yes. There's worker strikes. So of course, I mean the juice factory has to shut down. So that's definitely gonna affect supply. Next. Identify the direction of the shift. So how does demand and supply shift? Right, left? I don't know. How? So demand. How does a newly discovered health benefit of orange juice affect its demand? Okay. So it increases demand, right? Because now people would want to buy more. How about supply? How do the workers' strikes that close the factory close down? How does that affect supply? It decreases supply, right? Because there's one less factory to produce orange juice. So supply shifts to the left. Right. So let's apply the shift. So there's our original curve, original supply, original demand, original equilibrium. And again, this time we've got two shifts at the same time. So we need to try out a small shift for one and a big shift for the other, and then reverse that later and see if we get the same results. So let's try a small shift in supply and a large shift in demand. Okay? Now, first of all, let's shift the supply to the left. Worker strikes, supply shifts to the left, right? However, demand shifts to the right because there's more taste and preferences, so we shift that. And again, the intersection is now between the two new curves, right? So that will be this over here. Right. So let's have a look. New equilibrium price, new equilibrium quantity, equilibrium price, let's draw a line, that's there. Equilibrium price, that's over there, the new one. And as you can see, it's increased. Equilibrium quantity now. Vertical lines. So equilibrium quantity, let's draw original one over there, and let's draw the new one over there. So you can see it's also increased. Okay, so let's park that for a bit because now we have to do the reverse, where we apply a large supply shift and apply a tiny demand shift. Okay, now let's try a large supply shift. So that's quite a large one there. Again, shift to the left because worker strikes. There'll be less orange juice in supply. And then a small shift in demand. Okay? And again, there's a shift to the right because taste and preferences improved. And again, there's a new equilibrium point there. So let's check for the new equilibrium price and quantity. Equilibrium price, again, purple one is over there. That's the original one. That's the new one. And again, notice it's increased. So equilibrium price increases. However, equilibrium quantity, that's our original and that's our new, it's decreased. Right? So let's summarize what happened between these two scenarios. One with a large supply shift, small demand shift, and the other one, the first one, with a small supply shift and a large demand shift. If we have a small shift in supply but a large shift in demand, equilibrium price goes up. And equilibrium quantity also goes up. If we have a large shift in supply instead, if the shift in supply is greater than the shift in demand, the equilibrium price goes up as well, but the equilibrium quantity goes down. So if given the scenario that we had, we can say that the equilibrium price goes up, both of them goes up, and the equilibrium quantity, it depends. Okay, now what I've done here is, this is a hypothetical, so we don't actually know the real answer. Is the shift in supply bigger? Is the shift in demand bigger? We don't know. Right, so that's why it depends is the answer. Now, there's a lot more combinations that you could happen, right? You could have demand shift. You could have both demand and supply shift to the left. You could have both supply shift to the right and demand shift to the left. There's all sorts of combinations, and we're not going to discuss that now because, frankly, quite running out of time. However, you can take that as homework to determine what happens for all combinations. You have the tools with you right now in order to determine this. Okay? So, I leave that as an exercise. Thank you for listening. And on the next lesson, we'll be talking about what happens when the government intervenes. Okay? Thank you for listening, and I wish you all a good day. And again, just some image credits. Thank you.